Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the money behind the desperate journeys. Thousands have died on the perilous journey from Africa to Europe, and people are making money off it. Who are they? How are they doing it? And what about the migrants who do make it and have nothing to come to? Has Europe got a plan for them? Also this week, an uneasy peace in eastern Ukraine. The former boxing world champion and now mayor of Kiev, Vitaly Klitschko, gives us his thoughts on Ukraine's economic and geopolitical tensions. And with Iran coming in from the cold, what does its economy really need? And who else can possibly benefit? With every boat that leaves Africa's shores, the situation gets worse. The migrants, the people who want a better shot at life in Europe, risking their lives because legal channels just aren't open to them. It's their misery which creates an illicit market for people smugglers, and that is the cost we're counting this week. The millions in profits taken in, often for the ultimate price. It is estimated the human trafficking industry as a whole produces almost $26 billion a year. Smuggling is part of that, though not typically a part, we have to say, which would continue to exploit people in the way that human trafficking does. Most journeys, as we know, they happen across the Mediterranean Sea. Last year, we're looking at over 200,000 crossings and coming up for 3,500 deaths. But this is a global phenomenon. Look, when we widen the map out, we're talking about the Gulf of Aden as well. We're talking about the Bay of Bengal, also over in the Caribbean Sea. And as you see, these are in significant numbers. And look now at the complicated web which precedes the crossing. We're looking just at what happens in the Med here, where undocumented migrants from East and West Africa are trafficked through Libya. They come from all over the place. Somalia, Ethiopia, Ivory Coast, Senegal, Mali, all coming through to Libya. The Wall Street Journal reckons some tribes are charging as much as $60,000 for this part of the journey. And unfortunately, technology is exacerbating the problem. We live in an age of social media, and so too do the smugglers. Some openly advertise their services on Facebook, like this one. The Financial Times managed to snap it before it was taken down. A trip to Italy can cost $1,000. But if you're travelling from, say, Sudan to Libya, first of all, you pay another $1,700 on top of that. There's a WhatsApp and a Viber contact there as well. It is all made, as you see, frighteningly accessible. So it's a business as well as a human tragedy. We'll look at the former in a moment with our guest from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. But first, the stories of the people, their trips through Africa to the coast, which promises so much, and even a short trip from Turkey to Greece, another way in to maybe a new life. So it's a business as well as a human tragedy. We'll look at the former in a moment with our guest from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. But first, the stories of the people, their trips through Africa to the coast, which apparently promises so much, and even a short trip from Turkey to Greece, another way into perhaps a new life.
From the remote corners of Turkey's Aegean coastline, the distance between despair and hope for a new life in Europe via a Greek island can be just 25 kilometers. But overcrowded boats, Coast Guard patrols and ruthless smugglers make for a perilous crossing. Abu Sharif is a smuggler. He's about to take a boat full of migrants to the Greek island of Lesbos. This time, if he makes it, he'll blend in with the passengers and claim asylum himself.
I've never sailed a diesel-engine boat before, but I have to sail it tomorrow. I've never sailed out this deep. The sea is scary. I will be scared particularly, as at least 35 to 40 people's lives will be my responsibility. But a smuggler has no humanity. When I send you out to sea, you'll either make it or you won't. Either way, I'll make money.
Abu Sharif and his 29 passengers made it to Lesbos. He sent us these pictures. After a couple of days at this migrant reception centre, they'll be free to go on to Athens and beyond.
Migrants will pay anything between $900 to $2,000 to be squeezed onto a small boat that'll sail them over to Greece. That's Chios Island, just over there. Now, if they get intercepted by the Turkish Coast Guard on the way, they'll be brought back here. And Turkey stopped some 15,000 migrants last year. But most of them will just try again.
There's no shortage of potential passengers. In the western Turkish city of Izmir, at a known migrants pickup area, people wait with bags packed. Many will be from Syria, but there are also Iraqis, Afghans and people from Africa. Mohammed Tahsin from Syria is scared of the journey he'll have to make.
The UN and the international community haven't offered any alternative way to get to Europe. That's why we were forced to take this road to death.
The Turkish government says more migrants are taking to the sea here because it's tightened its land borders with Greece and Bulgaria. You can't, of course, throw barbed wire across the sea, so these routes will only get more popular with the onset of summer.
So with a problem as big as this, we need to start thinking about solutions, because it's highly unlikely the migrants will stop coming. Can some sort of future be mapped out for them before they even attempt a crossing? You know, go back to 1948 and think about the Marshall Plan. That was after World War II, when the US realized the importance of a prosperous Europe and so plowed the current equivalent of $120 billion into rebuilding European economies. It recognized that increased productivity and employment were valuable tools for a weakened people and continent. Now apply that theory to the migrant situation. Assist them, integrate them, create work for them, which benefits the host country. Maybe there's a potential Marshall Plan for North Africa. Let's talk to Tarek Osman about it. He's with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, joining us from our London studios, and we thank you for your time. You know, there's an example here of Morocco and something which Morocco and the EU have worked on together. They granted citizenship to 150,000 Africans, and you guys, the EBRD, invested more than $350 million to get people into work there. So they're there, you're creating work, it's good for the economy. That just seems to make sense.
The initiative between the European Union and Morocco is a very laudable initiative, of course, but it's targeting a specific situation. It's one measure among many others. The key issue is what you have highlighted before, which is the macro picture of, in North Africa, there's at least 100 million people under 30 years old. 2/3 of these are in their teens. So effectively, it's a no-brainer. It's an issue of education and therefore finding jobs after that. And what many international organizations, such as the EBRD, are trying to do is to identify areas of trying to help in that. In the case of the EBRD, it's through helping the private sector with a special focus on small and medium-sized enterprises, which, if you look at the economies of most of North African countries, that's a fundamental segment that could potentially increase the employment of the young.
So what do you think? You know, I outlined, just before we came to you, I outlined that sort of idea of a Marshall Plan, or applying that theory to North Africa. I mean, is that feasible, do you think?
Well, in North Africa, it has been touted a number of times right now that you need to have substantial increases in infrastructure and along the lines, a major investment framework along the lines that you have highlighted. Is it feasible? I hope it's feasible. However, we have to keep in mind, of course, that right now across many Western countries, there are austerity programs, there are huge fiscal issues. So it is an objective. Whether it is realizable in the short to medium term, I do not know. But what I think is extremely important right now is the focus again on not necessarily just the bridging the fiscal gaps in many North African countries, not just the pure infrastructure projects. Very important, all of that extremely important. But what is fundamental to the problem that you are raising is youth unemployment. How do you get that down? And how do you keep it sustainable, the idea of sustainable employment for the generations and generations of young Arabs who are coming to the market in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. That is the fundamental issue. And the private sector making a competitive, dynamic, sustainable private sector, especially small and medium-sized enterprises in these countries, I think that is the key solution.
Step back even further for me, if you could, and take it back to those countries where people are coming from. You talked about fiscal gaps. What are the fiscal gaps like in Eritrea, Somalia, Mali, all these places where the people are actually starting their journeys from?
You have a very frustrating situation sometimes, because you have, in many countries, especially in Eastern Africa and in Western Africa actually, you do have political instability that, of course, leads not just to the absence of foreign direct investment, but also to a huge slowdown, sometimes frustrating slowdown in local trade, in private investment from these countries into their own economies. All of that makes any kind of economic growth, even if it's really minimal, absent, extremely slow economic growth, sometimes no economic growth, sometimes contraction even. And again, that translates, forget about the macroeconomic statistics, it translates to very difficult social situations. And when you look at populations throughout North Africa, Eastern Africa, Western Africa that are very young, demographically very young, then it's logical that you find many people trying to escape the very difficult socioeconomic conditions. And the solution that many venture into, which is a very desperate solution, it tells you how desperate their situations are, is to try to risk it all, if you'd like, to reach the southern shores of Europe.
We need political resolutions
again,
as well, don't we? Sorry to interrupt you. We need political resolutions. Just so many of the countries, whether you're talking about the countries where people are coming from or where they're going to, you know, Libya, for example, there's so much political upheaval everywhere. This instability needs to be addressed, and I suspect that's going to be a really long-term thing.
Libya is an important point to highlight here because it has been the most important point of departure for many of those migrants. You're absolutely right in the sense that there are many problems in Libya. Sometimes it is portrayed as an issue of some tribes that have armed militias. Sometimes it's portrayed as the eastern province in war with the western province. In Libya, there are many unfolding tensions that are integrating and interacting with each other to create a very complicated situation. And right now, as you know, there is an initiative led by the United Nations to try to find some sort of a reconciliation. Of course, we wish them very well, and we are in close touch with them. But I think the situation in the country is very complicated, and I think Libya will take quite some time to arrive at any sort of stability. But the macro point, again, to go back to the issue that you highlighted, the macro point is absolutely correct. It is not just that political situations result in political dilemmas. They do have huge, both social and economic ramifications.
Tara Gosmary, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us on Counting the Cost. And still ahead on Counting the Cost, who are the potential winners and losers as Iran works to end its international isolation? We'll hear from an energy expert a little later in the programme. For now, though, we look at Ukraine, a country whose battles with Russia have created all sorts of geopolitical and economic issues. It's the type of thing which fired up former heavyweight boxing champion Vitaly Klitschko, who's now the mayor of Kiev. He led the protests last year, which brought a pro-Western government to power. Patricia Sapka from Al Jazeera America sat down with Klitschko to get his views on the way forward for Ukraine.
Ukraine's economy has deteriorated rapidly. You've had to hike interest rates to 30% to stop a free fall in the currency. You also have a bailout package from the IMF, $17.5 billion, but with serious strings attached, painful strings attached, cutting pensions, cutting energy subsidies, which must be a very, very tough pill for people to swallow. You have a mandate from an electorate, but are those reform measures, those austerity measures, is it making it difficult for you to keep people on side?
Yes, of course, it's a big part of reform, it's painful reform, but we have to show for what we do with that. It will be better. We have to change, we have to destroy monopoly, what have in Ukraine, have to destroy corruption, give a chance for business for working with equal opportunity for everyone. And I'm more than sure we have potential. The question how fast we use our potential of our country.
Of course, another thing that's probably very worrying to investors, to all investors, is uncertainty, and especially with regards to the security situation in Kiev. Hundreds of bomb threats in the last year, and just this month, 2 prominent pro-Russian figures gunned down in your city. Who do you think is responsible?
Somebody afraid of success of Ukraine after revolution of dignity. They try to destabilize situation. Actually, we have everything under control in capital of Ukraine. Kiev is saved.
How can you say it's safe, though, when you've had two prominent pro-Russian figures gunned down in your capital?
I'm more than sure it's provocation.
By whom?
Investigation, I'm more than sure it's very soon investigation give the answer. It's not the situation of Ukraine, it's provocation to bring the all shadow in Ukraine, in Kiev.
A provocation by separatists or a provocation by the Kremlin? Who? Who is the provocateur?
One of the both sides. It's never in interest of Ukrainian government.
What do you think is Putin's vision or endgame for Ukraine?
It's not secret. The idea is to rebuild new empire. And Ukraine have to play a very important role in this empire. We, Ukrainians, don't want back to USSR. Our future, almost 80% of population sees the future in modern European democratic country, Ukraine. It's our goal.
With regards to Ukraine's security future, do you want to see Ukraine be a part of NATO, or do you worry that if Ukraine is wedded into that alliance, that it will set it up to constantly be a pawn between Russia and the West?
Just Ukrainian population decide that, first point. And the chance to be part of NATO is big because all Ukrainians see our future in European Union. To be part of NATO or not, my personal opinion, yes. But it's a very sensitive decision, and this decision we have to do it with understanding with population.
Finally this week, Iran, where the pursuit of a nuclear program has taken a big economic toll over the years. But now, with Tehran agreeing with Western powers to limit that program, there is some potential for some very good economic times. Iran has been living with sanctions for almost a decade, but as you'll see, it was the latest round in 2011 that did the real damage. These numbers come from Iran's central bank. What was a $400 billion economy contracted 9% in the second and third quarters of 2012. And the US Congressional Research Service estimates Iran's economy is up to 20% smaller than what it would have been without the sanctions enacted after 2010. As international companies shut up shop, unemployment went up to 20% in the middle of 2012. Iran reckons the number is actually closer to 13%, but to put that into perspective, that would be 3% worse than US unemployment during the Great Recession in 2009. The thing is, Iran has got a lot going for it, namely the world's fourth largest proven oil reserves and the second largest natural gas reserves. But, according to the IMF, Iran's energy exports slumped almost 50% in 2012-2013, down to $63 billion. So that is all the bad news, but we did talk about some potential good times, didn't we? That'll happen if Western oil and gas companies return to revitalize the industry, which is in need of new technology and investment. Earlier in the week, I was joined by Sean Evers, Managing Director of the Gulf Intelligence, an energy networking firm, who's written a report on this very matter.
As a friend of mine, an Iranian friend of mine, said to me the other day, just for starters, it needs 100 five-star hotels. You know, so it needs everything. I mean, if you take an upgrade that's 40 years unaccounted for, from a consumer point of view, from a macroeconomic point of view, there isn't one thing you could say the economy of Iran does not need or would benefit from. So it needs everything.
Well, let's narrow it down to oil and gas then. What does it need from the rest of the world, investment-wise? And we're not just talking, quote-unquote, the West here. We're talking China as well. Tell me about what they can bring.
Iran needs a significant amount of foreign investment in order to upgrade its oil and gas facilities, to develop new oil and gas resources. So it essentially needs dollars and investment, and it also principally needs the lifting of sanctions in order for it to be able to sell all of its oil, in order to, you know, earn the revenue that comes with that. Iran depends, although the oil and gas industry only makes up 20% of its GDP, it depends on oil and gas revenues for 80% of its foreign revenue reserves.
Will those foreign investments come in? Iran has been somewhat demonized over the last few years. It's been through the sanctions period. The nuclear issue is always there. Yes, there's been a change in leadership and there's been a softening, we have to say, but will those companies want to come back, do you think? Have they been scared away, possibly?
Well, it'll all be in the terms of the opportunity that will guide the foreign investment. There's two things they'll have to consider. One will be, what is the legal framework from an international point of view vis-a-vis the lifting of sanctions? And that will be the first hurdle, because the probability may be that the sanctions are a bit of a fudge. As you may know, Iran, the lifting of the sanctions, I should say, will be a bit of a grey fudge in order for both sides to appear in a win-win situation. So the Iranians want immediate and complete lifting of sanctions. The Americans and the P5+1, as it's called, want some kind of phased out lifting of sanctions based on performance and compliance to the agreement. But in that grey zone, it will give the opportunity for some maybe European countries to say, well, actually, sanctions are sufficiently lifted for companies to go in and invest, and American companies who may be bound and limited by the Congress until there is a crystal clarity of legal framework might hold back. And it may be a bit like Kurdistan in Iraq, where a lot of small independent European companies poured in under a quasi-legal framework. There was a bit of a grey zone, and then as clarity emerged in the following years, the majors came in and bought up the equity and the opportunity from the first mover.
So if Iran gets itself together and gets it producing oil and gas like this and out into the market, how is that going to change the market? How is, say, Saudi Arabia going to afford this? And you know, with all the oil price fluctuations we've seen recently, how do you think that's going to play?
Well, Iran has what is generally regarded as 1 million barrels a day out of the market. Prior to the last wave of sanctions, which really restrained their export capacity, Iran was exporting about 2.5 million barrels a day in 2011-12. Now it's down to about 1.3, 1.4. So generally 1 million barrels is expected to come back on the market once sanctions permit it to. That time period, how quickly that comes back on, is the question. Generally, it's now acknowledged between 6 months to 12 months from a production point of view. But of course, they have a lot of oil in storage, which could immediately come on the market. So that will generally, the expectation, once the sanctions are agreed that exports can reconvene, prices could see a downward pressure again because of this extra supply, unless Saudi Arabia or other major producers in OPEC, for example, facilitate the return of Iran by pulling back some of their production, or else we could see another wave of downward pressure on the oil price.
Can I ask you about China as well? Surely it had a chance to get in there with Iran, whilst all these Western sanctions were in place there. Didn't it have a chance to sort of exploit that almost?
Well, China had unfettered access to Iran over the last few years with limited competition from, let's say, Indian companies and so on. But actually the Chinese either chose through intention or by default and inability to blow that opportunity. They were actually evicted out of a major oil field development in North Azerbaijan oil field a year ago. They had the rights to develop an oil field. They were expected to drill about 180 wells. They drilled only 7 over the time period and were actually evicted a year ago, nearly to the day, that from that oil concession opportunity. They retained the South Azerbaijan. It's 2 oil fields on the border of Iraq. And so generally relations with China are surprisingly a little bit tense. The Indians and the Chinese have either chosen not to engage heavily and develop the opportunities there, or they haven't had the technology or the ability to do so.
And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on when you'd like. You can also get in touch with us by tweeting either me at KamalAJE. There is our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali as well, and you can use the hashtag AJCTC for those tweets, or just drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.